In an environment where sunlight barely penetrates the thick, muddy water, something enormous is still moving. Right now, you are looking at the most beautiful rainforest on Earth. But if we could peel back the trees and drain the soil of the modern Amazon, we would find a graveyard. Not just any graveyard, a place filled with bones of monsters that make a great white shark look like a goldfish. 13 million years ago, the Amazon rainforest didn't exist. In its place was a sea the size of a continent, a lost world of giant swamps, flooded plains, and predators that defied the laws of physics. By every rule of biology, a monster this big shouldn't be able to survive here. So how does it? Today, we are diving into the phantom sea of the Miocene. We are looking for the giants that ruled before the jungle took over. We will discover the physical limits of how big a creature can grow, the hidden costs of being a titan, and the mystery of why these kings eventually lost their crowns. You are looking at a world where the laws of nature were pushed to the absolute breaking point. To understand the giants, we have to look at how the Earth changed. Today, the Amazon River is a long, winding line that flows into the Atlantic Ocean. But millions of years ago, the Andes Mountains rose up like a giant wall on the west coast. They trapped all the rain and river water in the middle of South America. This created the Pebus system. It wasn't a river, it was a shallow, warm sea that stayed still for millions of years. Because the water was warm and full of plants, it was like a giant buffet that never closed. Snails grew to the size of basketballs. Fish were everywhere. This constant food supply allowed animals to grow to sizes we can't even imagine today. When there is that much food, nature doesn't just stop. It experiments. It builds bigger, heavier, and more dangerous life forms. But evolution has limits, doesn't it? Let's look at the first giant of the Phantom Sea, Stupendemys. This wasn't your average backyard turtle. This was a freshwater turtle with a shell over 10 feet long. It weighed more than a modern SUV. If you stood next to it, the top of its shell would reach your chest. In science, there is a rule called the square cube law. It is the most important law in biology. It means that when an animal gets twice as big, it doesn't just get twice as heavy, it gets 8 times heavier. This is why you don't see ants the size of dogs. Their legs would snap instantly. For Stupendemys, the square cube law was a nightmare. A shell this big made of solid bone is incredibly heavy. Recent research shows that a shell this heavy would be almost impossible to carry on land. The legs would simply collapse. So how did it survive? The water did the work. The buoyancy of the sea acted like an invisible hand, holding up the turtle's heavy armor so its bones didn't have to. Stupendemys was a tank, but it was a tank that could only move if it was floating. It was trapped in its own success. But even a giant tank has a predator. And in the Phantom Sea, the predator was the stuff of nightmares. Moving through the murky water was a creature that redefined what it means to be a killer. Purussaurus. Imagine a caiman, but stretch it out until it is 40 feet long. Give it the weight of 2 large elephants. This was the king of the Miocene. To understand its power, scientists studied its skull using a method called metabolic scaling. They discovered that Purussaurus had a bite force of 69,000 newtons. In simple terms, that's 7 tons of pressure. It's twice as strong as a T-Rex. If a T-Rex and a Purussaurus ever met, the king of the dinosaurs would have a very bad day. Purussaurus didn't need to be fast or sneaky. It just needed to wait. With one snap, it could crush through the bony shell of a giant turtle like it was a piece of dry toast. But being the king of the world has a hidden cost, doesn't it? To grow this big, Purussaurus used a biological trick called Gigantothermy. Because it was so massive, its body stayed warm all on its own. It didn't have to eat constantly to stay warm like a human or a lion does. This made it a very efficient hunter. But there was a catch. To keep an 8-ton body moving, it still needed a huge amount of fuel. Recent field studies suggest that a predator this size had to eat nearly 100 pounds of meat every single day. In a sea full of giant turtles and massive rodents, that was easy. But it meant Purussaurus was a slave to its environment. It was a specialist, and in nature, being a specialist is a dangerous game. If the food disappeared for even a few months, a giant that needs that much fuel would be the first to starve. The Phantom Sea felt like it would last forever. For millions of years, the water stayed still. The giants ruled. But the Earth is never truly still. The Andes Mountains kept growing higher and higher. Eventually, the land began to tilt. The wall that held the water in was starting to lean toward the east. Slowly, the giant sea began to drain away into the Atlantic Ocean. The still, quiet swamps turned into fast-moving rivers. The lost world was being washed away. This was the end for the giants. The giant snails couldn't live in fast water. The giant turtles couldn't swim against the strong currents. And most importantly, the deep water that helped them float was gone. Imagine being a Stupendemys turtle. For millions of years, the water held you up. Now the water is gone, and you are stuck in the mud. Your own shell, the armor that kept you safe, is now crushing your lungs. Could a creature this size truly adapt to a world that was shrinking? Recent fossil research tells a tragic story. As the water drained away, the giants were left behind. The Purussaurus found itself in a world that was too small for it. The giant prey was dying out. The deep pools where it hid were turning into shallow streams. There wasn't enough food left to feed a 40-foot monster. The very thing that made them kings, their massive size, now made them weak. They couldn't hide. They couldn't travel long distances across land. They were a masterpiece of evolution that no longer had a place to live. Within a few thousand years, a blink of an eye in geological time, the giants were gone. They were replaced by smaller, faster, more boring animals. The ancestors of the caimans and turtles we see in the Amazon today are the ones who survived. Why? Because they were small. They didn't need 100 pounds of meat a day. They didn't need a sea to hold them up. They were efficient. Evolutionary success isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being the best at surviving change. Nature does not create giants without consequence. Every advantage carries a cost. The monsters of the Phantom Sea were a grand experiment in the limits of life, but they were eventually broken by the very planet that created them. The square cube law always wins in the end. Today, the Amazon is a place of green leaves, colorful birds, and hidden life. It is the lungs of our planet. But if you look closely at the riverbanks or dig deep into the red clay, you will find the shattered bones of a world far more alien than we can imagine. In the wild, survival is never guaranteed. No matter how big you are, no matter how hard you bite, change is the only constant. And even the biggest kings are eventually reclaimed by the earth. Next time you look at a map of the Amazon, try to see the Phantom Sea. Try to imagine the 40-foot shadows moving beneath the surface, and remember that underneath the beauty of the jungle, the giants are still there, waiting in the dirt.